Hello, and welcome to our Lunar Reflections podcast, where we've been journeying with the moon while Jupiter was in Cancer over the last year. And each month we've released an episode to coincide with the new moon. And today we'll be discussing the upcoming Cancer new moon. But this episode is also a wrap up of not only Jupiter in Cancer, but several other notable transits that are culminating this week in quite challenging astro weather, including Mercury retrograde. So we're going to try our best today. I'm Tara, an astrologer from the UK.
I'm Helen, an astrologer from Scotland, also in the UK.
Great. And before we dive in, I want to thank you, Helen, for being a wonderful co-host. I've really enjoyed journeying with the moon with you and all of our amazing guest astrologers along the way. I don't know about you, but I feel like this year's flown by.
Yeah, and likewise, Tara, it's been such an interesting journey and the rhythm of it and the interesting people that we've been talking to, as well as like learning from each other, has been really amazing.
Yeah, no, I think it's quite a literal manifestation of Jupiter in Cancer. I think that kind of connection through community and togetherness, and rather than, working in silos and alone, it's been really nice, like connecting with like-minded people, which I think,
Yeah.
yeah, kind of epitomizes, sorry, Jupiter in Cancer. I think we've
Yeah.
had some, tough astro weather over the last year, and Jupiter in Cancer has been, I don't know, a beautiful balm to kind of help soothe the friction in a way. Collectively, we've been dealing with multiple wars, climate change, cost of living, generally dealing with modern life, which can feel, really draining. And I think the lunar ruled Jupiter has definitely reminded us about the importance of belonging and family, both literal and our kind of metaphorical family, the family that we choose, I think
Mm.
is really important. Um, Personally, it's been in a mutual reception with my Sagittarius moon, which has definitely helped bolstered my own optimism through challenging times. I think spiritually, my relationship has strengthened and deepened significantly over the last year. It's been in my 12th house,
Mm.
transiting over my Time Lord Mars. And I think that's been a saving grace in kind of a draining year where I've continued to battle burnout, like so many of us. I've also had a stronger connection to the collective energies and deeper pull to my ancestors and maternal line. That Mars is ruling my fourth house. Therapy has been transformative. We even did an ancestors ritual in therapy, which was really healing and eye-opening. And yeah, I've just had some really amazing experiences this year. I've had a Venus and Mars altar, which I personally I felt has been quite life-changing because I've developed a more, I don't know, rounded understanding about that part of my chart. So I've really, really enjoyed Jupiter in Cancer, and it only happens once every 12 years. And yeah, I've been really, really grateful for this year. How have you
Mm.
found that transit?
Yeah, Jupiter in Cancer, I'd say it's been overall very positive. And as you know, I've got a cardinal rising chart, so it's been angular. So definitely feeling it quite intensely. And it's the ruler, Jupiter's the ruler of my midheaven as well. So being exalted has sort of brought, it's definitely brought strong effects, and it's felt like a time of quite a lot of change. And the sort of you were talking a bit about belonging and family and those kind of themes, which feel like they've been at the fore collectively as well as kind of individually as well. And there's then this kind of longer term story as well. And I think we touched quite a lot on the podcast about, the we were still mindful of that Mars retrograde, that fateful Mars retrograde that took place, and the long transit of Mars in Cancer in 2024. So in a way, Jupiter in Cancer was like the clean up on Io, whatever the part of the chart Cancer is for us. So in my case, it was a really that axis of self and relationships, and it was bringing a positive and sensitive kind of tone to reflections about how I relate to others and the themes along those lines. And I think it was something I don't know what you think about this, but something I thought was kind of interesting to reflect on is with Jupiter in Cancer, and we were kind of paying quite close attention to it because of the podcast, and I started in a lunar year as well, that the moon being ruled sorry, Jupiter being ruled by the moon the whole time, it did have this, it wasn't this consistent feeling of
Mm,
that you might, you know, that it's Jupiter in Cancer feeling. There's this rhythm where, you know, certainly it was notable whenever the moon was in Pisces and Sagittarius and we had that mutual reception. There was often that kind of, you know, definitely that affected the way that things felt. And
mm,
that it's interesting to think, and we'll come on to it, but with Jupiter moving into Leo, that's a bit of a more of a solar rhythm that it will adopt. So maybe there's going to be a bit of a sense of stabilization with that. But I think there's been an enlargement of the Cancerian sensitivity as well, you know, the sort of big feelings component
mm,
to it as
mm.
well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. It's so when you've got something lunar, nothing really stays the same for very long. And I think it has definitely helped with the rhythm of the moon, understanding the different signs. It's felt louder each time that there's been a shift. Because each sign kind of moves from that kind of yin yang, that earth water moves constantly through that kind of air fire, and it feels like we're kind of shape shifting the whole entire time.
Mhm.
And I think, yeah, those big emotions, that big sensitivity, but it's also just helped us, I don't know, feel more human. And the human side of, for me, especially looking at, the nature of suffering, the nature of what it means to be human, it feels like this year has really highlighted that, and how you can get caught up with the mundane and the external and all of the things that life kind of throws at you. But essentially, the way that we connect with each other is so important, especially in times like this where it feels quite chaotic in that external world. I've
Mhm.
really been grateful for it, even though it has been, volatile, because every 2.5 days we've got this new lunar feel. And I think you're right, the Jupiter ruled moons have been especially highlighting. And I think it was interesting that just before Jupiter left Cancer, we had that mutual reception in that Sagittarius moon as well, almost like a little send off. And I think it's great that even though we're now Jupiter in Leo, we're in Cancer season, so we still have, like, it's not as jarring as it could be, because we've still kind of enveloped in that Cancerian energy.
Yeah, so more of a transition in
Mm.
that sense, and
Mhm.
but there's a clear kind of direction of travel. I don't know how you found it when Jupiter ingressed. So we're recording this on Thursday, 2nd of July, and we're just a few days in, and the ingress was for me marked by I was literally just had just had a offer to buy a new home accepted and coming into thinking about mortgages and things like that, which is a really
Mhm.
literal
Very
eight,
eighth
eighth
house.
house. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So I don't know if you felt if you found anything noticeable as yet, but
Mm, yeah, I mean, yeah, nothing as loud as that and as obvious as that, even though it is angular and it's moving into my first house. But maybe if we just speak a little bit about the new moon in Cancer, and then we can kind of segue into Jupiter and Leo, because I
yeah,
think,
sure.
yeah, because I think the new moon in Cancer, we started a year ago with the new moon in Cancer. It was the first one with Jupiter there, and this will be the first moon in Cancer without Jupiter there. And I think it's quite interesting to see what that shift will be. So that's July 14th. It'll be at 21 degrees, and locally that's a Virgo rising chart. I'm sure if it's the same for you where
Hmm.
you are, but
Yeah.
there's a wide orb for conjunction with Jupiter in Leo, ruled by that new moon. And so I do think that this first lunation without Jupiter in Cancer is still picking up those themes. And we've mentioned before, I don't think there's going to be such an abrupt switch. And I think it's interesting that this new moon is sandwiched between this newly ingressed Jupiter and Mercury, which is
Mhm.
obviously retrograde. So I think there's still a need for quiet internal reflection. It's for me, it doesn't feel like a loud new moon. It's not making any other major aspects, so it feels cocooned in a way. It feels, the luminaries are definitely ruling the show. Um, but I don't know, I did notice that Mars Uranus. conjunction, which we can't escape.
Mm.
It's at the top of the MC and it's squaring kind of like this fallen Virgo Venus, which I think can bring kind of some friction to the chart. Um, what have you picked up from this new moon chart that's coming up?
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting the timing, just as Jupiter has ingressed and they're sort of widely connected. Jupiter's still the exaltation ruler of the sun and moon. The sun is ruling Jupiter. They're very widely conjunct, and that retrograde Mercury, I think it's about a day and a half after it's been Kazimi. So
Hmm.
I feel like that retrograde Mercury in Cancer with all the emotionally sensitive communication and communication difficulties in some cases is definitely part of the vibes there. There's this mercurial sense of things, and it does hit my chart because my descendant is in the third decan of Cancer. So it definitely feels like the new beginning in that section after Jupiter has left, and we've had those experiences with extended experiences with first Mars, then Jupiter for not about a year, and now those changes don't reverse back to the way they were before. We now
Hmm.
have the new beginning in that Cancer section, so it feels like that new moon feels like at the beginning of the new time after that, and there's definitely an opportunity to reflect, just as we are doing just now. But it feels like with Mercury retrograde in that section, it's a good time to remember the emotional experiences
Hmm.
that we've had and to kind of reflect on what the changes there have meant for us, what the experience has been, and that I think Mercury, I didn't check the exact dates, but it's well into its retrograde at that 19
Hmm.
degrees
Hmm.
51. And so it when it stations direct, there will be like this sense of forward momentum, hopefully, over
Hmm.
there, while we sort of shift emphasis a little bit into the Leo section, which we'll come on to talk about a bit later. But yeah,
Yeah.
the Mars Uranus conjunction. So as we're recording this right now, it's just applying, and it's on another one of my angles. So feeling that one quite intensely, and it's there. I think Jupiter, what strikes me is Jupiter's at 3 degrees in this new moon, and
Hmm.
it's up to its own thing as well, because it's just 1 degree from getting into the famous Barbeau's basket, where we've got this configuration between Uranus at 4 degrees Gemini, Aries sorry, Neptune at 4 degrees Aries, Pluto at 4 degrees Aquarius, and Jupiter is going to be the final outer planet that really sets off this configuration of mostly trines and sextiles, all in fire and air signs. Because you were talking about the yin and yang contrasts earlier. Well, these are all yang signs, and
Yeah.
then Jupiter's going to really come up, quite soon after that to spark all of that off. And so it feels like there is this sense of like one foot on one side of something and one foot on another, and Jupiter's just about to really maybe bring home for us in our own natal charts as well as collectively what's been building in this
Hmm.
configuration with all the outer planets as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really interesting point. And it will be interesting to see. It's just I just love the way astrology kind of comes together in the way that, nothing's it's all feels like by design, that there's no accident that this is all kind of culminating in this way. It's no accident that we're even recording in this kind of pinnacle of the week where everything's kind of coming together. I wanted to pick up on what you said about the fact that this Mercury retrograde forms a big part of this new moon chart. And obviously, retrograde, especially Mercury, is about remembering and memories in the past. And that's very much highlighted and illuminated even more so in Cancer. And I think the fact that we've, like you mentioned, that Mars retrograde that we had in 2024, then we've had this Jupiter transit, and then we've got this really interesting new moon chart. I do think like you said, this one foot in each side, but there's still a lot of looking back and a lot of thinking about the memories of those past connections and how those look moving forward. I think there has been probably a shift in the way in which we value connection. I think more than ever, especially living in such a modern, digitally forward facing kind of world that we live in, it's so easy to lose sight of what's important in terms of how we connect with others. I'm always I'm doing it myself, but whenever I commute or I'm going somewhere, I'm always saddened by just how many of us are just in our phones and not really, having that human connection. And I think this new moon can kind of remind us that that's important as we kind of shift away from that kind of Cancerian feel. I don't know if
Yeah.
any of that's made sense.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it links back in some ways to what we were saying about Jupiter in Cancer and Jupiter being exalted. Jupiter's finding its joy in the 11th house, and that kind of the connection, the connection between our social connections and our optimism for the future. And there's almost this sense where that's coming in with the new moon as well, where it's revisiting that almost. It's maybe a good moment to not just reflect but commemorate.
Mhm.
If you do any kind of rituals, probably a good moment to sort of mark what we've just experienced. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking as well, like it's got this wide square from Saturn and Aries as well, and where Aries is kind of, we can think of as the sort of most individualistic and self-focused of the signs, and it's one thing that Saturn and detriment in that kind of environment can potentially signify is loneliness and isolation. Whereas
Mm.
the moon in Cancer, certainly a new moon in Cancer, such a supercharged lunation, is about connection, and it's the last marker on that Jupiter's presence there, enhancing that side of it. So there's almost that, exactly that contrast or that tension that you just mentioned, that we just live in a world where we're supposed to be more connected than ever before, but some of these technologies are disconnecting us at the same time, even as they connect us. And
Hmm.
so taking a step back from all
Hmm.
of that and maybe being, taking a bit of time for self-care, a bit of time out for reflection, whether that's in therapy or whether that's speaking to a friend or whether it's journaling, it feels like an apt way to use this moment of renewal.
Yeah, no, I completely hear everything you're saying. I love your word of commemorate. I think that's a brilliant word to kind of sum up the transits we've been experiencing in our Cancer house. And we have to think about, as we segue into talking about Jupiter in Leo, when we think about Leo and Cancer in the chart, those are the luminary houses. So, for those listening, really focus on those two houses because they are distinct in the sense that they don't share rulership with anyone else. Leo and Cancer are like the princesses of the
Mhm.
the chart of the zodiac. The luminaries have their own kind of standing, and almost, you have Aquarius and Capricorn, for example, both ruled by Saturn. I do see Leo and Cancer, even though they're ruled by different luminaries, I still see them as like a double act as well. And so, they're not going to be, you don't view them in isolation, I would say, even though obviously they're averse to each other in terms of houses, there's a continuation there. And I guess that kind of segues really nicely into Jupiter in Leo, which happened June 30th, so only a few days ago. And we've talked about this switch from lunar to solar. So from something quieter, softer, more internal and reflective to this louder but warm energy. There's generosity there. There's an element of fun. It shouldn't feel as heavy or as emotive. We're moving from water to fire, so from reflection to action. And because the ruler is the sun. You talked about this more structure. There might be more of a rhythm that feels a bit slower than that moon, that lunar transits that we've kind of had. I think as we move through the solar calendar, I think it's lovely, as I've said, that it's in this initial transit is ruled by the sun in Cancer. So that handing over the baton should feel, I hope, feels smoother and less jarring. We still have that lunar influence, which has been comforting us personally. So you've talked about how loud that Jupiter's been in your eighth house. I mean, how literal in terms of that house offer.
Mhm.
Just I love it. But mine has been not as interesting. I've got a first house stellium, so Jupiter's right on top of it. It's obviously angular, and I have constantly struggled with ADHD, dopamine chasing, sugar cravings, which I just gotten under control, but have spiraled definitely this week. So I need to be mindful that Jupiter in the first house can lead to weight gain because it amplifies, it expands the first house of the physical body. So I would just say, shout out to the Leo risings, just be more aware of cravings. I'm really gonna get on top of it. I feel like it's just the ingress that's made it kind of, I don't know, explosive, and then it will kind of settle down. Um, but more positively, I think there's definitely an opportunity for good fortune around creative potential, artistic pursuits. Leo rules children, romance, creative expression, authenticity, leadership. I think all of these themes will be amplified as we also enter Leo season, because I'd pay attention to the planets as they form a conjunction with Jupiter. So July 23rd, we'll have the Sun approaching Jupiter. Mercury will approach it August 9th. Venus has already moved on, but then we've also got the Chiron square. We have to talk about Chiron, Helen. The Mars-Uranus sextile, and then obviously the Pluto opposition. So it just feels like there's so much going on, and there's like so much that we can kind of talk about in terms of all of those aspects. But yeah, what's your feelings on this Jupiter Leo transit?
Yeah, so it's interesting for me. It's in one sense it's the eighth kind of whole sign house, but in another it's kind of coming in because I've got Aries and Sagittarius planets. Transiting planets in Leo will ultimately configure into a sort of grand trine at different points. So I'm hoping that that will be, one mitigating positive factor. Thinking thematically, I was thinking along some similar lines to you in terms of creativity and self-expression. And I've had some hints around that, in the last year or so, and especially relating to the sort of, I think really the Neptune transit approaching my sun. I've been involved in kind of dream incubation programs, and as part of that, I've managed to take up and at least try to do some creative things like watercolors, which I think I struggled before with the kind of it's very hard to learn these things, because you have to not
Mhm.
be good at them for a while. But really doing it in
Mhm.
a way of where I had the most success was really getting past any sense of aesthetic judgment, and into a kind of if I can do something with colors that expresses something that I feel or a dream that I had or something that I want that I can't put in words and or is pleasing to me, then that's a win, So I
Yeah.
think, and I think it is there's these themes with Leo as well of like courage and authenticity and
Mhm.
courage in general. I think that thing of putting yourself out there or trying to do something creatively self-expressive, it requires courage unless you've been really nurtured for that stuff from a young age, which not everyone is. So I think I'm hoping that for me that's one positive way to kind of make the most of that transit and experience. And I think the opposition with Pluto, which you mentioned, is going to be one of the first
Mm.
things that we'll deal with. And I was wondering if it might be actually a good way to check in on whatever the kind of very slow burn Pluto and Aquarius transit is for us, because obviously some people with like angles and planets in the early part of fixed signs maybe feeling that more kind of consciously. And for me it's segued out of the Pluto square and even kind of separated from squaring. I've got one planet at the beginning of Scorpio, and because it has been so slow as well, and because the intensity has reduced so much after you have Pluto on your ascendant and then squaring natal Pluto, after that it becomes a lot more background noise when all
Mhm.
of that's faded. But I suspect that whenever Jupiter, by the time of the new moon, we were just talking about, is it 3 degrees already? So it's like it's a degree away because Pluto's been retrograde. I think it reached 5 degrees and then retrograded back.
Mhm.
Then that will be maybe sparking off, that whole axis in our chart. So for me, it's second house, eighth house, and it could be things around, our our relationship with our own power, or our power versus other people's or societies, or whatever the house topics are. So in my case, kind of money and you know, the balance between resources and income and what we do for a living versus what happen, you know, the kind of longer term and financial security stuff, which will link with the Chiron and Taurus for especially for our generation. But yeah, those are some of the thoughts that I've had around that, as well as, you know, longer term. We'll talk a bit
Hmm.
about the South Node ingress as well, I think.
Yes.
And at
Yes,
some
yes.
point the two will come together,
Oh, yes.
which is kind of, you know, a while away, but that will be an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I've got the dates for those, so we'll talk about those later because there's actually an early one in November. But I just wanted to pick up your point around, well, first of all, leaning into the artistry, creativity and sitting with, not having things perfect. I think that's great that you've been able to access that part. And I think that, because Leo can be so proud and can care so much about what other people think, I think I think lighting up that Leo chart will help us confront those fears of how we're seen, and care less around that, I think, and just lean into how that creativity kind of feeds our soul. I feel like, especially, I don't know if it was the Jupiter and Cancer transit, but just understanding how we as humans need to create. I think it's a part of being human, and quite often we don't have the space or the time to do that because we live in such a busy world. And I think, yeah, I love that you've been able to carve that time out because it actually is important. And I think people don't realize or don't have the time or energy to kind of, it becomes something that kind of drops off the list. And you've got a list of priorities. Being creative never really comes high on that list. And I think hopefully this Jupiter and Leo can kind of ignite that within us, because I think being able to remember what it means to be human is actually what grounds us and helps us, in those difficult times. And
Absolutely.
just yeah,
Mhm.
and I was just going to say, so that looping back to Pluto, it's actually right on top of my South Node. So I have South Node 1 degree Aquarius and North Node 1 degree Leo. So Pluto's been going back and forth over that South Node for a very long time anyway, even as it was approaching before it entered Aquarius. So I do think Jupiter's obviously going to amplify that. It's obviously my angles, its relationships, its sense of self, all the things that I've been kind of going through. And, we have to remember that Jupiter, yes, it's a benefic, yes, it's optimism and positivity, but it will amplify whatever it amplifies. And that's the good, the bad, the ugly. And I just want to, yeah, just caveat without being too negative, that just be mindful of what Jupiter will be amplifying and bringing to the forefront, because some of it might be confronting, but ultimately, I think the things that are confronting eventually set you free.
That's a really important point to make, and it links in again with something you said earlier that I wanted to bring out a bit more as well, which is the kind of, I suppose, the shadow side
Mm,
around kind of both the sun, both Jupiter and Leo can be not the most modest of energies, and so
hmm
like the kind of, yes, it may be about finding the courage to take up space if that's something we've lacked, but there may also be the other side of it, might be kind of keeping our ego in check, and the
hmm
Pluto opposition could be that experience in a way of like coming up against other people's resistance or other people's jealousy, or maybe we're projecting those qualities onto other people. But unless
hmm
we consider that and get and reflect, then we, you know, we won't be conscious about whatever it is. So I think there's definitely a sense in which there is an opportunity there, and or an invitation to sort of
hmm
consider where we're coming from, and our right to self-express versus the kind of feelings of others,
Yeah,
and you know, those kind of tensions that we all have to navigate. Maybe it will be
yeah,
a time when we can usefully reflect on our ways of being around those kind of dimensions.
yeah. No, really good point. I think, like Cancer, Jupiter and Cancer has helped us value the importance of connection and others, whereas the Leo energy can become like self-reflecting and or self-focused. And so I think we have to be mindful of not just thinking about ourselves in terms of that ego sense of things. So I think, yeah, it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting balance. Um, Shall we move on to Chiron? I definitely want to
Yeah.
talk about Chiron. There's been, it moved into Taurus a few weeks ago, June 19th. So for anyone born approximately 1977 to 1983-ish, I think, will now be starting their Chiron return. So ages 42 to 49. Um, this transit roughly lasts 7 years. We've already spoken about the fact that it forms an immediate square to Jupiter, which I think exaggerates those Chiron ruins initially. I think the ingress and early days of any transit can feel particularly potent. And although this can point to healing, it will feel challenging at times. I think this is the time to draw strength from your own personal faith rather than relying on the collective kind of traditional viewpoints. It's kind of, what do I think about these things, and what's my personal relationship with faith in this kind of healing journey that I'm on. Personally, it's happening in my 10th house. Chiron is the only placement above the horizon for me, apart from Mars. But I see the 10th house as not only career and public recognition themes, which I'm definitely going through, but I'm doing my first in-person astrology conference talk at the Astrological Association conference in September, which is terrifying. And I'm just like, okay, that's a nice Chiron return to the 10th house story there for me. But I also specifically, for me, see the 10th house relating to the mother wound. It's the parental axes. And so this kind of segues into, I've spoken to you before, Helen, about this Melanie Reinhardt book. I've just been drawn to it, even though it's been sat on my shelf for months, years. I've kind of pulled it out as Chiron's made its return, and it's happening right. The Chiron return happens right in the middle of a bunch of midlife transits, and it can, like I said before, it can feel confronting. But Melanie talks about a lot of interesting ideas. Um, I think I messaged you last week about it, and one that struck me most was about this prenatal energy that she says begins in the womb as we're being formed inside our mothers. And she says it's important for those approaching the Chiron return to talk to their moms about the condition of the birth, if this is possible, obviously. And the condition of the birth in the first few years after Chiron gives some clues to the themes and necessary healing that comes with this return midlife. I was delivered by forceps, so that's something I need to reflect upon and sit with for a while. And Melanie says after 50 years, the Chiron cycle begins again, and the repeating themes are reflective of those early years, which we're naturally programmed to forget. And she says, pay particular attention to that first aspect that Chiron makes in the chart, because this will be illuminated again for the first time since birth and will be a fundamental part of that healing journey. So for me, the first aspect is the opposition to my moon Uranus opposition. So again, not only represents my mother, but and therefore the maternal line, but also my neurodiversity. I believe that the moon Uranus aspect is likely, or I don't know, has an ND signature. I've not done enough research yet, but my late diagnosis came during that opposition, that Uranus opposition, which activated my moon. And Moon Uranus is sudden insights, eccentric personality, volatile emotions, a strong sense of intuition. And when we think about neurodiversity in the sense of sensory overwhelm and emotional dysregulation, it kind of makes sense that this was what ignited everything. I'm due to start ADHD medication later this year, so I do see that as part of my Chiron story. And yeah, I know I've kind of done verbal diarrhea about Chiron, but it was just in me at the time. And obviously you're going through we're similar ages. So what's your kind of reflections on Chiron in Taurus?
Yeah, I felt it really strongly, and I think, and I wrote my first blog post on my new website about it, which I'm going to. I found I had to keep it under
Hmm.
control in terms of word limit, so I'm going to have to come back to it and do like kind of a series of different topics. I focused on the discovery degree, and my next
Mm.
the next area of focus for me will be the return of the discovery chart. So it's about 3 degrees 08, if I remember rightly, in Taurus. But that's more on a kind of mundane level. In terms of
Hmm.
Chiron return, because as you said, we're Chiron in Taurus. I don't think there's any coincidences in astrology, in the cosmos. And Aries is the very longest sign that Chiron takes to transit because of the maverick elliptical orbit that the strange little planet takes. and Taurus is second longest. So those of us having our Chiron returning these signs, we're now up as the Chiron and Taurus generation. It's a long process for us. It's not something that will kind of take a short time if you think about it in terms of the sign, which I think many astrologers do these days. And so these themes around kind of the scarcity versus enough and stability and security that are Taurian in nature, they affected us at the time of our birth because we kind of grew up in a time of socioeconomic downturn and anxiety and also excess as well that was characterizing the late 70s and early 80s in the 20th century. Those themes are kind of baked into our generation, and I think they'll come up for all of us in some shape or another. That's not to say predict anything concrete about anyone's economic circumstances, but to say that it's subjective and that Taurus has to do with values and our kind of resources and what we value, because Venus has to do with kind of what we value as well, but it can also have to do with connection with nature, which can be something we value. So there's some nice themes in there that we could be working with consciously for those of us having our Chiron return anytime in the next, 7 years, as to when it goes exact. And I think that's where I've been thinking. And I think the next piece that I'm going to write, I want to explore more, I draw on the mythological um, archetypes for these kind of things. And I think we have to with a body that's been discovered so recently as 1977. And the one of the aspects of Chiron is around, teaching and mentorship, and that thing of, if you Chiron as a character, if you like, he was the teacher to heroes and demigods, and in some cases, I think gods, because he was wise, because he was knowledgeable. And I think we all need to have someone to turn to who's more experienced and who we can trust to look to for guidance. I think there's something very human about that, and maybe when we're in the Aries part of our chart, we're less conscious of that, but that there's maybe a sense in which Chiron's bringing a sense of the knowledge that we need to draw on and the value of experience. And so the transiting Chiron can hit the chart in various different ways, obviously, in terms of natal planets and so on. And maybe, I think it would be nice to kind of bring out that element a little bit more, because I think the wounded healer is not disconnected from that. But I do think it's
Mm.
a dimension of Chiron that we don't talk about as much. But that's more of a digression, really, for this podcast.
No, really interesting. I loved reading your Discovery Chart article because I think it's yes, Chiron's been around forever. It's obviously always been there, but the fact that it came into our existence and knowledge in 1977, and now we're now in that return. I think it's yeah significant, and I think it is worth examining. I think it's interesting, like you said, from the discovery chart, how Chiron's kind of separate from everything else, and it kind of reinforces that kind of, I don't know, sense of loneliness, otherness, feeling, like we're on the outside almost, and how we kind of fit in. It's kind of antithesis to the Cancer energy of belonging and feeling a part of a community, where you kind of with Chiron can sometimes feel like an outcast, and
Mm.
where do I fit in? And I think you made a really good point around it's a long transit, so even though it's just entered, for me it's not going to go exact until 2031 at 22 degrees, so
Mhm.
it's not something that happens overnight. But also the themes that come up during the return aren't just brand new themes. There'll be things that you've either suppressed or been vaguely aware of, or may have dabbled in, but this kind of brings the mirror up and kind of forces you in a way. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting. You've already had like a Chiron return reading. I've had a Chiron return reading. I think for those of us going through that, turning to something like astrology to help guide, like I think it actually connects with what you're talking about, needing a mentor or a guide, like someone that can kind of help support us in in this journey, I think is important as well.
And yeah, just to add one more thing to bring it also back to the moon again, I think earlier you mentioned the mother wound,
Hmm.
and the thing with Chiron, when I was researching that first piece, just thinking about the mythology and then focusing on the discovery chart as a chart for humanity's relationship with Chiron, it's really interesting that we found it in Taurus, which has got Venus and Moon rulership, and
Hmm.
Chiron was rejected by his mother. It's a very
Yes.
tragic way that he came into the world, and in which his mother, upon seeing him, was revulsed by him. So
Hmm.
no matter how valued he was by gods and kings, and how respected and revered he could be in one way, he never belonged among his own people, and
Hmm.
that sense of othering probably stayed with him forever. And
Hmm.
so I do wonder as well, if part of what he embodies for us as a collective is that wound I think everyone carries to some extent,
Hmm.
that because we talked about this from the beginning on the podcast about the moon as that kind of attachment, and that sooner or later that the attachment that we have to nurturance gets broken because we have to set off out into the world. We have to become like a separate person. So there's
Mm.
some part of everyone that's wounded from simply not being able to stay in the womb, and then
Exactly.
again from having to grow and develop and become independent. And I think that Chiron's return to its discovery degree is almost like a collective version of that for all of us.
Yeah, no, I think you've made such a good point, and I think it links really nicely to what Melanie talks about in terms of go back to the condition of your birth, go back to the time when you know you are expelled from your mother, but and you literally cut the cord, and you're left to your own devices. Obviously, not literally because you're being cared for, but there is that sense of abandonment because and there's a reason why we don't remember those first 2 years because it can feel quite destabilizing from the comfort of the womb to this
Mhm.
loud and scary world where yes you're still with mother but there's that severance, and I think it does tie in to that Chiron theme. So I think all of that is super interesting, and I think this could definitely be a future podcast episode because I can feel that we want to talk more, but let's
Yeah.
move on to the last two transits that we're going to talk about today. So first of all, we've got this Mars-Uranus conjunction in Gemini. It's ruled by Mercury retrograde in Cancer. I mean, thank you. That's exactly what we wanted. But this transit happens every 2 years. I don't want to scaremonger, but it can feel explosive. It can feel loud. Uranus shocks, and I think this week is feeling particularly challenging with so many planetary shifts. We got Uranus that entered the Gemini chat in April, and then Mars joined the party June 28th. It goes exact in a few days on the 4th. So this is a volatile conjunction. It's ruled by freshly retrograded Mercury. So on top of kind of unexpected action, we have this kind of murky confusion of miscommunication, misunderstandings in the watery sign of Cancer that does not like conflict or confrontation, but is confronted quite starkly with this Mars Uranus kind of conjunction. So I would just say go gently, think before you speak, beware of other people's volatility and ability to hold complex emotions and feelings. Try not to take too much of that on. I think it's quite easy for us to do that sometimes. There might be this rush of excitement, guard against carelessness, accidents, but also I think there is this kind of visionary, actionable energy. There is potential for great breakthroughs, but there's so much going on in the cosmos that it can be hard to kind of see the wood for the trees. On a mundane level, there is concern. I wouldn't, I've got to say, around violence, sudden shocking upheaval, shaking up. Kira Rydberg talks about airline travel disruptions, transport networks innovation, changes in the global economy. All of these are kind of Gemini and Uranus themes. And then you've got Mars, who's just like, action, let's do this, but ruled by this Mercury that's like, whoa, let's just slow down a little bit. So ground yourself, south soothing techniques, take a break from the constant absorption of the news, get outside into nature where possible, meditate, connect in person rather than digitally. That's all the things that kind of downloaded to me as I was thinking about this conjunction.
I wouldn't have a lot to add to that in terms of the delineations. The Mars Uranus combination. I don't think it is any kind of doom mongering to say explosive is just the archetypal rendering of it. Of course, it's going to hit us all differently depending on the natal chart. It's right on an angle for me. I've really so far only felt quite irritable at times, and so
Mhm.
that it can absolutely vary in terms of how it hits, but being mindful of it, all of the advice you just gave, and chiefly for me is just, count to 10 before reacting, just
Mhm.
on a stereotypical level is just you may feel just a little bit more highly strung or short fused. And then again, just as well being aware of my American friends and our American colleagues
Mm.
that then the birth chart of the United States of America obviously has a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Gemini. So there's maybe a sense in which some people in some parts of the world will feel it a bit more
Mhm.
intensely. And so hopefully
Yeah.
it comes, it passes without any major, external world manifestations. But I guess it comes back to all of the lunar themes as well around we have to take care of ourselves, whatever is going on of that kind.
Yeah, no, really good point. I think I didn't quite realize that there's a Mars Uranus Gemini conjunction in the US. So yeah, I echo, your support of those across the way. And yeah, it's there's only so much we can do personally. And so I think I'm heavily relying on this diagram that my friend sent me, the circle of control and what you can and can't control, and external events are out of our control. How we respond to them, how we respond to people, how we kind of root and ground ourselves is what we can control. And so that
Yeah.
would be, my parting kind of advice around that. I just think, yeah, given the volatility of this week, we couldn't not include it. But unless you've got anything else to say about that, shall we move on to our final transit? It hasn't happened yet. We've alluded to the nodes. They've been in Virgo and Pisces for the last 18 months or so. They're going to change sign July 25th, and we'll shift into Leo and Aquarius. So we have a shift from the axes of service and servitude, sacrifice, to the axes of individuality in the group, freedom of expression. I think it represents a karmic shift, calling us to prioritize community still, objective collaboration, and the collective good where possible. I think you've mentioned before around the challenges of letting go of ego-driven validation, performative identity, the need to be the center of attention. I think moving instead towards this kind of shared goals and future building. We've got Pluto there, obviously in Aquarius as well. Personally, it's been in my second and eighth house axes, and after Saturn's long transit in that house, I've learned a lot about better managing my finances, my attitude to the idea of lack and scarcity as well. This is, my Venus is in my second house, so my self-worth, but also what I value. Lately I've been really reflecting on the fact that different people value different things and decide to spend their money accordingly. Some choose to save and live frugally, other values life experiences and spending money on things that bring them joy. There isn't a right or wrong, is what I'm picking up, even though there's a lot of judgment in the way, we kind of expect people to manage their money, but it's helped me understand the complexity that the theme of money brings to our lives. The eighth house of shared resources, me and my husband finally made our wills earlier this year. So the idea of death is less confronting, and my relationship with those matters has matured and become less terrifying, but it's definitely a work in progress. So this going to be this shift to my first and seventh house axis of self and the other. So relationships will continue to be a focus for me over the next 18 months. Also in relation to how I view my own sense of self and how I relate to others. The nodes will be approaching Pluto in Aquarius. So there's going to be an excavation of our deepest needs and psyche too. And I think what's really interesting is the Leo house will simultaneously have Jupiter at one end and the South Node at the other. They'll meet and cross over around 25 degrees in November. And I think possibly in the future, I haven't looked at all the dates. So we have this dual story of enlightenment and wisdom and letting go of past behaviors that no longer serve us. So yeah, there's a lot going on. How are you approaching these nodes? How's it been for you?
Yeah, so interestingly, it's just entering my second house, eighth house axis, as we touched on earlier on. So while you're wrapping up that kind of experience, that's going to be the start of it for me. The Virgo Pisces axis is interesting. So for me, it's the third house, ninth house, and that probably, flavors how I've been thinking of it in terms of a tension between kind of imagination versus perfectionism and lessons around like the extent of control that's needed versus the dreams and intentions that we sort of have. And personally, a lot of studying about astrology and also consciousness studies and other more metaphysical topics. So I think my mind has been on the reshape towards really thinking quite big about the, well, quite literally almost philosophies around how we are a shared cosmic mind that has oneness, and at the same time we have individual minds but which are part of that. It's a very, very, very ancient idea, and it's one that has been very much on my mind around about this time when the nodes have been in my third house, ninth house axis, which probably fits quite well. And the self versus collective balance is something else that I was thinking about, for us all, even though it's definitely going to be for the first house, seventh house axis, maybe more pronounced. But definitely there's that we were talking about, the Leo transit of Jupiter, and that kind of almost that tension between our individual self-expression and our desire to be seen and recognized by others versus the needs of society. And likewise, we've also touched in this conversation a lot on the effects of what's going on in society on us as individuals. And so there's always that balance to navigate. But I guess that certainly collectively for us, we might see that tension writ large in some of the kind of cultural contexts. And individually, yeah, for me, it's second house, eighth house. There's going to be potentially some more of just effort and focus on that sense of resources and stability and long term, trying to save for the long term and things like that is something else that I would like to do. And I'm hoping that the South Node isn't detrimental to that, but that it's going to be more of an integration between the two.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I think it's yeah, super interesting to have the house kind of in the ingress is coming at either end because obviously for most planets they're moving in a forward direction, but because the nodes obviously circle back through the signs, I just think it's super interesting that we've got kind of the door being opened on both sides of that Leo house, and that you're going to have this kind of simultaneous duality going on for the next year or so, and how that manifests itself. So yeah, we'll I'm sure we'll probably have a standalone chat about that as well. In fact, we could probably put all of these transits into kind of like standalone discussions where we can kind of deep dive a little bit more, which would be, super interesting. But
Mm.
yeah, what a week or few weeks that we're kind of experiencing now. And I think this probably kind of wraps everything up. So, I want to just say, give this time to just thank a special thanks to our listeners. I've really enjoyed doing this podcast. The listeners have brought their own kind of energy and attention to each of the different topics. We've had some amazing guest astrologers. Thank you to each and every one of you that joined us and brought your own kind of unique take and spin on things. And, I've already thanked you, Helen, but again, for being a wonderful co-host. I've really enjoyed bouncing ideas off of you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the future where we kind of deep dive on everything and all things Astro and beyond. We'll definitely be back with some ad hoc interesting topics of discussions. So yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, thanks again, Helen.
And thank you, Tara, for the notion, the idea of the concept of the podcast. And I think it was a really great one. And it's been, as I said earlier, it's been a really fun and interesting process. And just like to echo everything you just said, to thank everyone who's listened and everyone who's come on the podcast and shared their insights. Really appreciate all of that.
Great. So enjoy the summer, what's left of it, and look after yourself. And until next time, take care. Bye.